The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, when Leora Hale finally collapsed at the gates of the Vane Fortress, her bare feet numb beyond feeling, and her threadbare cloak offering no protection against the howling wind that cut through her bones like shards of ice. She'd been walking for weeks, fleeing circumstances that had left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, she might find shelter before the winter claimed her life. The fortress rose before her like something carved from nightmares and ancient power. Black stone walls that seemed to absorb what little light the storm allowed. Towers that pierced the gray sky with the arrogance of something that had never known defeat. This was the stronghold of King Ragnar Vane, the Lycan king whose name was whispered with the same reverence and terror reserved for natural disasters. He ruled the northern territories through fear and absolute authority, commanding loyalty from packs that had warred for centuries before his iron will had brought them to heel. It was the last place in Omega nobody should dare to approach. It was also her only chance of survival. Leora dragged herself to her feet with the last of her strength, her hands so cold she could barely feel them as she pounded on the massive iron gates that protected the king's domain from the outside world. The sound was swallowed by the wind, but she kept hammering against the metal until her knuckles split and bled, leaving red stains on black iron that spoke of desperation beyond rational thought. "Please," she called out, her voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "Please, I need shelter. I'm freezing. Let me in. I beg you." The gates remained closed, silent and impassive as the fortress walls that surrounded them. Of course they did. Kings didn't answer the pleas of dying Omegas, especially not kings whose power had been built on the understanding that mercy was weakness and compassion was a luxury that rulers couldn't afford. But desperation made her bold in ways that survival had never required before. "I'll reward you," she shouted, the words torn from her throat by wind that seemed determined to steal even her voice. "Let me in, and I'll reward you. I'll work, I'll serve, I'll do whatever you require. Just please don't let me die out here like this." The promise was absurd. She had nothing to offer a king who commanded the wealth of entire territories, no skills that would be valuable to someone whose word could reshape the political landscape of the continent. She was a homeless Omega, with no pack, no family, no resources beyond her own desperate willingness to trade anything for the chance to live through the night. But the words hung in the air like a vow spoken before witnesses, and something about them seemed to resonate with forces beyond the natural world. The gates opened. Not slowly, not grudgingly, but with the smooth efficiency of machinery that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to respond. Leora stared through the gap in disbelief, hardly daring to believe that her impossible plea had somehow been answered by someone with the power to grant it. A figure emerged from the shadows beyond the gates, tall, powerfully built, moving with the predatory grace that marked all apex wolves. Even through the driving snow, she could see that he was everything the legends claimed. Broad shoulders that spoke of strength beyond ordinary limits, dark hair that seemed to absorb the storm's gray light, and pale eyes that held depths of controlled violence that had built an empire from the bones of his enemies. King Ragnar Vane stood before her, and Leora felt her remaining strength abandon her as the full weight of what was happening crashed over her consciousness. "You're freezing," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that could command storms to cease or mountains to move. "And you've promised to reward me if I grant you shelter." "Yes," she whispered, hardly believing she was having this conversation with the most feared ruler in the Northern Territories. "Yes, Your Majesty. Whatever you require." "Whatever I require," he repeated, as if testing the weight of words that carried implications she couldn't begin to understand. "Interesting. Do you understand what you're offering, Omega?" "I'm offering anything that might convince you to let me live through this night," she replied honestly, too cold and exhausted to craft diplomatic lies. "I have nothing else to bargain with." King Ragnar studied her for a moment that stretched like eternity, his pale eyes seeming to catalog every detail of her desperate state, the blue tinge to her lips that spoke of advancing hypothermia, the torn clothing that provided no protection against the elements, the hollow look of someone who had been surviving on hope and willpower for longer than the human body could sustain. "Very well," he said finally. "I accept your offer. You may enter my stronghold and accept my protection, but understand that your promise creates a debt that will be paid in full, according to terms that I alone will determine." The words should have terrified her. Any rational person would have recognized that accepting undefined debt to the Lycan King was potentially worse than freezing to death in the snow. But as warmth began to seep back into her body, as she felt the promise of shelter replacing the certainty of death, all Leora could feel was desperate gratitude for the chance to see another dawn. "Thank you," she breathed, stepping through the gates into a courtyard that felt like salvation itself. "Thank you, Your Majesty," as the iron gates closed behind her with a finality that spoke of thresholds crossed and fate sealed. As she followed the most powerful man in the Northern Territories toward warmth and safety she'd never dared to hope for, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that her desperate promise had set in motion events that would change both their lives in ways neither could predict. She had offered to reward the king for his mercy. What she didn't understand was that her very presence was already reshaping everything about the man who had answered her plea, awakening instincts he'd thought were buried, stirring desires he'd learned to suppress, calling to something in his wolf that recognized her as more than just another desperate supplicant seeking royal favor. The debt she'd promised to pay was about to become far more complex than either of them had imagined. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The interior of the Vane Fortress was everything Leora had expected and nothing she'd prepared herself for. Corridors carved from black stone stretched in directions that seemed to defy architectural logic, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with tapestries depicting centuries of conquest and dominion. The air itself felt heavy with power, not just the political authority of absolute rule, but something more primal that made her Omega instincts hyper-aware of the predators that called this place home. King Ragnar led her through hallways that could have accommodated armies, past doorways that revealed chambers furnished with the kind of luxury that represented generations of accumulated wealth. But it was the silence that unsettled her most. Not the empty quiet of abandonment, but the watchful stillness of a place where every footstep was noted, every breath was catalogued, and every stranger was evaluated for their potential to disturb the careful order that kept chaos at bay. "You're shaking," the king observed as they stopped before a door that looked identical to dozens of others they'd passed. "I'm still cold," Leora replied, though she suspected her trembling had more to do with delayed shock than lingering effects of the blizzard. The reality of her situation was beginning to penetrate the desperate relief that had carried her through the first moments of salvation. She was alone in the stronghold of the most feared ruler in the continent, bound by a debt she didn't understand to a man whose mercy might prove more dangerous than the storm she'd escaped. "Among other things," King Ragnar said, his pale eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity, "this will be your chamber. Food will be brought shortly, along with clothing more suitable for indoor temperatures." The room beyond the door took her breath away with its unexpected warmth and comfort. A sitting area furnished with chairs that looked handcrafted by masters, a bedroom containing a bed large enough for 4 people, and most miraculous of all, a fireplace where flames already danced with cheerful efficiency. After weeks of sleeping rough and months of making do with whatever shelter she could find, the luxury felt almost overwhelming. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, hardly daring to believe that such comfort was being offered to someone in her circumstances. "More than I could have hoped for. It's adequate for your needs while you remain under my protection." King Ragnar moved into the chamber with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged everywhere within his domain. "Which brings us to the matter of the debt you've incurred by accepting that protection." There it was. The accounting she'd known would come, but had been too desperate to worry about when survival was the only consideration that mattered. "What kind of debt, Your Majesty?" "The kind that will be determined by the value of what you've received and your capacity to provide compensation." His voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine business arrangements, rather than the fate of a woman who had nothing to offer, beyond her willingness to serve. "You've been granted shelter, safety, food, and clothing. In exchange, you'll provide whatever service I determine to be appropriate payment. And if I'm incapable of providing service that matches the value of what I've received, then your debt will be extended until such time as adequate compensation has been rendered." King Ragnar's slight smile held no warmth, only acknowledgement of power dynamics that left her with no negotiating position whatsoever, which could be a considerable length of time, given your apparent lack of resources or marketable skills. The implications were clear enough that even someone in her desperate state could understand them. She'd traded potential death from exposure for certain bondage to someone whose authority was absolute and whose mercy came with prices that might prove higher than she could afford to pay. "How long do such debts typically last?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the fear that was replacing relief as the practical realities of her situation became clearer. "That depends entirely on the debtor's willingness to work and the creditor's satisfaction with the service provided." His pale eyes never left her face, as if reading responses she didn't know she was displaying. Some debts are discharged quickly. Others become permanent arrangements. Permanent arrangements meaning what exactly? Meaning that some people discover they prefer the security of defined service to the uncertainty of freedom. King Ragnar moved to the fireplace, his attention apparently focused on flames that cast his sharp features in light and shadow, particularly people who have nowhere else to go and no other means of supporting themselves. The observation hit closer to her actual circumstances than she was comfortable acknowledging. She did have nowhere else to go. No family or pack connections that could provide support. No resources beyond her own determination to survive whatever challenges life presented. In practical terms, permanent service to the king might be the best possible outcome she could hope for. But accepting that reality felt like abandoning the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain throughout the series of disasters that had brought her to his gates. "And if I prefer the uncertainty of freedom to the security of permanent service, then you'll be free to leave once your debt has been satisfied." His tone suggested that such preferences were merely theoretical considerations, rather than realistic options for someone in her position. Assuming, of course, that you survive whatever circumstances drove you to seek shelter here in the first place. The casual reminder that she had nowhere else to go, that leaving his protection would likely mean returning to the conditions that had nearly killed her, was delivered without malice, but with the kind of practical clarity that made further argument pointless. "I understand the terms," she said finally. "I accept whatever debt my shelter has created, to be discharged according to your assessment of appropriate compensation." "Excellent. Then we have an understanding." King Ragnar turned from the fireplace to face her directly, his pale eyes holding depths she couldn't fathom. "Your service will begin tomorrow morning. Tonight, you'll rest, recover from your ordeal, and prepare yourself for whatever tasks I determine to be suitable for someone with your limited qualifications." As he moved toward the door, leaving her alone with luxury she'd never expected and obligations she couldn't escape, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just agreed to something far more complex than simple indentured service. The way he'd looked at her during their conversation, not with the dismissive assessment she'd expected from someone evaluating a new servant, but with the kind of intense focus that suggested personal interest rather than mere practical consideration. The way his presence seemed to fill whatever space he occupied, making her hyper-aware of every detail of his movements and expressions. The way her own body had responded to his proximity with awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition, she didn't want to examine too closely. Most unsettling of all was the growing certainty that her desperate promise to reward him had awakened something in the king that simple gratitude couldn't satisfy. Whatever debt she'd incurred by accepting his protection, whatever service he intended to require as payment, she suspected it would involve far more than the routine domestic tasks typically assigned to palace servants. As night fell over the fortress, and she settled into comfort that felt like a dream after weeks of hardship, Leora found herself wondering whether she'd escaped one form of danger only to embrace another that was potentially far more complicated to survive, because the Lycan King's mercy had come with conditions she was only beginning to understand, and the reward she'd promised might prove to be something he was prepared to claim in ways she'd never imagined. The next morning, Leora woke to find clothing laid out for her that was both practical and elegant. Simple garments made from fabric that felt expensive against her skin, cut in a style that flattered her figure while remaining appropriate for whatever tasks she might be assigned. The transformation from desperate refugee to well-dressed palace resident was so complete that she barely recognized herself in the mirror. A soft knock at her door announced the arrival of a servant bearing breakfast on a silver tray. Fresh bread, preserved fruits, cheese that tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months, and coffee that seemed designed to restore not just energy but hope itself. The abundance felt almost overwhelming after so many weeks of rationing whatever food she could find or afford. "His Majesty requests your presence in his private study at your earliest convenience," the servant informed her, his tone carrying the kind of professional courtesy that suggested her status within the palace hierarchy was still being determined. The private study was located in the fortress's upper levels, accessible through corridors that seemed designed to impress visitors with the scope of royal authority. When she knocked on the heavy wooden door, King Ragnar's voice called for her to enter, and she found herself in a chamber that revealed more about the man than any throne room could have managed. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their spines showing titles in multiple languages and covering subjects that ranged from military strategy to political philosophy to what appeared to be advanced mathematics. Maps covered a large table in the chamber's center, marked with notations that suggested active planning rather than historical reference. And behind a desk that looked carved from a single piece of ancient oak sat the king himself, reviewing documents that bore the seals of various territorial administrations. "Good morning," he said, without looking up from his papers. "I trust you slept well and found the accommodation satisfactory." "Very satisfactory, Your Majesty. More than I had any right to expect." "Expectations have nothing to do with it. You're under my protection, which means you're entitled to treatment appropriate for someone serving the crown." King Ragnar set aside his documents and gave her his full attention, his pale eyes studying her with the same intensity she remembered from the night before. "Today will determine exactly what form that service will take. I'm prepared to undertake whatever tasks you consider appropriate, Your Majesty." "Are you? Even if those tasks extend beyond conventional domestic service?" The question carried undertones that made her pulse quicken with wariness. "What kind of tasks did you have in mind?" "The kind that require intelligence, discretion, and the ability to observe social dynamics without drawing attention to yourself." King Ragnar rose from his chair, moving to stand before one of the maps that dominated his workspace. "Tell me, Leora, what do you see when you look at this?" She moved closer to examine the map he'd indicated, studying territorial boundaries marked with symbols that seemed to represent military positions, trade routes, and political alliances. But it was the pattern of red marks scattered across the northern regions that caught her attention, too regular to be random, too specific to be decorative. "Trouble," she said finally. "Those red marks look like reports of unrest or conflict, and they're concentrated in areas where pact territories meet territorial boundaries." "Very good. And what would you conclude from that pattern?" "That someone is deliberately stirring up conflicts between pacts and border regions, probably to test your response capabilities or create instability that could be exploited later." King Ragnar's expression showed approval that felt more personal than she'd expected from someone evaluating a servant's analytical capabilities. "Exactly right. Which brings us to the nature of the service I require from you, which is, I need someone who can move through pack gatherings and social events without being recognized as an agent of the crown, someone who can observe interactions and report back on conversations that might reveal the source of these manufactured conflicts." His pale eyes met hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Someone whose background provides perfect cover for gathering intelligence that could prevent civil war." The proposal was so unexpected that Leora felt her mind struggling to process its implications. "You want me to be a spy. I want you to be my eyes and ears in places where traditional agents would be recognized and neutralized before they could gather useful information." King Ragnar moved closer, close enough that she could catch his scent of winter storms and controlled power. "Your status as an Omega with no pack affiliations makes you invisible to most alphas, which means you can observe without being observed in return. And if I'm discovered, then you'll be protected by resources that extend far beyond what any enemy agent could bring to bear against you." His voice carried the absolute certainty of someone whose authority had never been successfully challenged. "But discovery is unlikely if you're careful and intelligent about how you conduct your observations." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. To serve as the king's personal agent, to have access to intelligence that shaped the political landscape of the continent, to be trusted with responsibilities that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined when she'd collapsed at his gates. It was the kind of opportunity that could transform her from desperate refugee to someone whose contributions mattered on a scale she'd never dared to dream. But it was also dangerous beyond anything she'd ever contemplated, involving deception and espionage that could result in consequences far worse than simple exposure to the elements. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Surely you have agents with more experience, better training, established networks of contacts." "I have agents with all of those advantages," King Ragnar agreed. "But I don't have anyone whose invisibility is so complete that even other Omegas wouldn't think to watch them carefully. You're not just unnoticed. You're beneath notice, which makes you potentially the most valuable intelligence asset in my service. The assessment should have been insulting, but instead it felt like recognition of abilities she'd never considered valuable before. Her lifetime of being overlooked, of being dismissed as unimportant, of learning to observe without being observed in return, all of it had been preparation for service she'd never imagined. What would this service involve specifically? Attending pack gatherings throughout the territory, listening to conversations about political developments, noting which alphas seem unusually interested in territorial conflicts. King Ragnar returned to his desk, pulling out a document that looked like a formal contract. In exchange, your debt would be considered fully discharged, and you'd receive compensation appropriate for someone providing intelligence services to the crown. And if I prefer domestic service to espionage, then you'll serve in whatever domestic capacity I determine to be most useful, for however long it takes to discharge a debt that could extend considerably longer than intelligence service would require. His slight smile held no malice, only acknowledgement of practical realities that left her with limited options. The choice was clear enough that even someone in her position could recognize the obvious advantages of accepting his proposal. Intelligence work would be dangerous, but it would also be finite, challenging, and potentially lucrative in ways that domestic service could never match. More importantly, it would give her the chance to prove that her survival skills extended beyond simple endurance, to capabilities that could be genuinely valuable to someone whose authority shaped the lives of millions. "I accept your proposal, Your Majesty," she said, understanding that she was crossing another threshold that would reshape her life in ways she couldn't predict. "When do I begin?" "Immediately. There's a gathering tomorrow night at the Blackwood Estate, hosted by Alpha Marcus Blackwood, to celebrate his son's coming of age. Intelligence suggests it will be attended by several of the Alphas, whose territories have been experiencing unusual conflicts." As King Ragnar handed her documents containing details about the gathering, about her cover story and the specific information he needed her to gather, Leora realized that her desperate promise to reward him had evolved into something unprecedented. She was no longer just a refugee seeking shelter, or a debtor working off obligations to her benefactor. She was becoming an agent of the crown, someone whose observations could prevent wars, and whose loyalty could reshape the balance of power throughout the northern territories. The reward she'd promised had become something neither of them had anticipated. Not gold or simple service, but partnership in work that mattered on a scale that could affect the future of the kingdom itself. Whether she would prove capable of living up to that unexpected responsibility remained to be seen. But for the first time since her circumstances had collapsed into desperation, Leora felt like she was moving towards something that resembled a future, rather than simply trying to survive until tomorrow. The Blackwood Estate sprawled across the hillside like something from a fever dream of wealth and power, its Gothic spires piercing the evening sky, while warm light spilled from hundreds of windows to paint the snow-covered grounds in golden patterns. Carriages wound up the circular drive in an endless procession, delivering passengers whose laughter and conversation drifted across the winter air, with the careless confidence of people who had never known want or fear. Leora sat in a modest coach that King Ragnar had arranged for her transportation, wearing a dress that struck the perfect balance between elegance and invisibility. The deep blue fabric was well made, but not ostentatious, the cut flattering, but not attention-grabbing, the overall effect designed to mark her as someone respectable enough to be present, but unremarkable enough to be ignored. "Remember," the king had told her during their final briefing that afternoon, "your goal is to observe, not to participate. Listen to conversations about territorial conflicts. Note which alphas seem unusually well-informed about incidents that should be outside their direct experience. And pay attention to anyone who expresses opinions that suggest prior knowledge of planned unrest." The instructions were clear enough, but as Leora watched the parade of powerful wolves entering the estate, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step into a world where one mistake could have consequences extending far beyond her own safety. The Great Hall of the Blackwood Estate was a symphony of controlled chaos, with hundreds of guests moving through spaces designed to accommodate crowds while creating intimate conversation areas where business could be conducted under the guise of social interaction. Pack hierarchies were on full display, alphas holding court at the center of attention clusters, betas facilitating conversations and managing practical arrangements, and omegas serving refreshments or providing the kind of decorative presence that spoke to their host's wealth and status. Leora accepted a glass of wine from a passing servant and positioned herself near one of the room's massive pillars, where she could observe without being observed, while remaining close enough to overhear conversations that might reveal useful intelligence. The incidents in the Eastern Territories have been remarkably convenient for certain political interests, she heard a woman saying to a small group of attentive listeners, almost as if someone wanted to create justification for increased military presence in those regions. "Careful, Lady Voss," a male voice replied, with the kind of jovial warning that carried genuine caution beneath its surface humor. Speculation about political convenience can be misinterpreted as criticism of royal policy. Not criticism. Observation. There's a difference between noting patterns and questioning authority. The woman's voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking her mind, regardless of who might object to her opinions. Though, I suppose that distinction matters less than one might hope when dealing with kings who prefer their subjects to avoid inconvenient observations. Leora moved closer, using the crowd's natural flow to position herself where she could see the speakers as well as hear them. Lady Voss appeared to be in her early 40s, elegant and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had earned her position through intelligence rather than inheritance. Her conversation partners included two men who radiated the predatory confidence that marked successful alphas, and a younger woman who listened with the focused attention of someone gathering information for later use. "The question isn't whether the incidents are convenient," one of the men said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "The question is whether they're coincidental or coordinated. Because if they're coordinated, someone with considerable resources is investing significant effort in creating instability. And if they're coincidental, then we're looking at spontaneous unrest across multiple territories, which suggests underlying problems that could explode into something much more dangerous than isolated incidents." The analysis matched intelligence that King Ragnar had shared during her briefing, confirming that awareness of the pattern extended beyond the royal court into the broader Alpha community. But it was the younger woman's response that caught Leora's attention. "Has anyone considered the possibility that both explanations are partially correct?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of careful consideration that suggested formal training in strategic thinking. What if someone is exploiting genuine grievances to create incidents that serve their larger political objectives? Meaning what exactly? Meaning that the underlying unrest is real, but it's being amplified and directed by someone with the sophistication to turn spontaneous discontent into coordinated action. The younger woman's eyes were bright with intelligence that seemed older than her apparent age. Someone who understands pack psychology well enough to predict how territorial alphas will respond to perceived threats. The conversation was moving beyond general observations into specific analysis that could be valuable to the king's efforts to identify whoever was orchestrating the conflicts. Leora focused on memorizing details while maintaining the appearance of casual social attendance. Such sophistication would require intimate knowledge of pack dynamics throughout the Northern Territories, Lady Voss observed, which suggests either an insider with access to multiple territorial administrations, or an outsider with intelligence networks extensive enough to provide that level of detailed information. "Or," said a new voice that made everyone in the group turn with expressions of surprise mixed with wariness, "someone with legitimate authority to coordinate activities across territorial boundaries." Alpha Marcus Blackwood himself had joined their conversation, his presence transforming casual speculation into something that felt more like interrogation. He was a man in his 50s, powerfully built despite his age, with silver threading through dark hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his guests' responses to his unexpected participation. "Alpha Blackwood," Lady Voss said with the kind of polite acknowledgement that carried undertones of caution. "I hope you're not suggesting that legitimate authorities are behind the incidents we've been discussing. I'm suggesting that assuming illegitimate coordination might be premature when legitimate coordination remains a possibility." His smile was sharp with predatory satisfaction. After all, maintaining stability sometimes requires actions that appear destabilizing to people who don't understand the larger strategic picture. The implication was clear enough that even Leora could recognize it as a warning. Whoever was orchestrating the incidents might have official sanction, which meant that investigating too aggressively could bring unwanted attention from authorities who preferred their activities to remain unexamined. "Of course," the younger woman said carefully, "though one might wonder why legitimate coordination would require the kind of secrecy that makes it appear illegitimate to outside observers." "One might wonder about many things," Alpha Blackwood replied, his tone carrying the kind of gentle menace that suggested certain wonderings were healthier than others. But wise people limit their wondering to subjects that don't risk misunderstanding by authorities who value discretion. As the conversation dissolved into safer topics, pack politics, trade agreements, social gossip that carried no implications beyond immediate entertainment, Leora understood that she'd witnessed something significant. Alpha Blackwood's intervention hadn't been casual social participation. It had been a deliberate warning to people who were asking questions he preferred they avoid, which meant either he was involved in the coordination they'd been discussing, or he was protecting someone who was involved, or he was simply cautious about conversations that could attract unwanted attention from higher authorities. Any of those possibilities would be valuable intelligence for King Ragnar, but determining which was accurate would require more careful observation than could be accomplished during a single evening's surveillance. Leora continued moving through the gathering, listening to conversations that ranged from routine pack business to speculation about royal policies, to gossip about territorial alliances that might affect future political developments. But it was the pattern of interactions rather than specific conversations that proved most revealing. Certain alphas consistently drew others into private discussions that ended when uninvited listeners approached. Certain topics generated immediate changes in conversation when particular individuals entered hearing range, and certain guests seemed unusually well informed about incidents that had occurred in territories far from their own sphere of influence. By the evening's end, she had identified at least 6 alphas who warranted further investigation, noted 3 different instances of conversations being deliberately terminated when sensitive topics arose, and confirmed that awareness of the incident pattern was widespread enough to suggest either a significant intelligence leak or coordinated information sharing among the participants. But it was the final conversation she overheard that provided the most concrete intelligence about potential threats to royal authority. "The king's response has been remarkably restrained," she heard someone saying as guests began departing for the evening, "almost as if he's waiting for something more significant before taking decisive action. Or as if he's not sure who he can trust within his own administration," came the reply. "Hard to take decisive action when you don't know which of your advisors might be feeding information to your enemies. Assuming he has enemies organized enough to require intelligence networks. Could be that his restraint comes from recognizing that overreaction would create more problems than the original incidents. Maybe, but restraint can also be interpreted as weakness by people looking for justification to challenge royal authority more directly." The analysis sent ice through Leora's system as she realized that King Ragnar's measured response to the territorial conflicts was being evaluated by potential enemies as evidence of vulnerability rather than wisdom. If certain alphas were testing his resolve through orchestrated incidents, his careful approach might actually be encouraging more aggressive challenges to his authority. As her coach wound down the hillside away from the Blackwood estate, as she reviewed everything she'd observed and overheard during the evening's surveillance, Leora understood that the intelligence she'd gathered was both valuable and deeply troubling. The king was dealing with threats that extended beyond simple territorial unrest into potential challenges to royal authority itself. And those threats were being coordinated by people with enough sophistication to exploit his cautious leadership style as a tool for undermining confidence in his ability to maintain order. Her first assignment as his intelligence agent had revealed problems far more complex than either of them had anticipated. The question was whether the solutions would prove equally complex, or whether addressing the threats would require the kind of decisive action that could reshape the political landscape of the entire kingdom. Either way, her reward for the king's mercy was becoming something neither of them had expected when she'd collapsed at his gates, seeking nothing more than shelter from a storm. Dawn was breaking over the fortress when Leora returned from the Blackwood gathering, her mind still processing the implications of what she'd witnessed throughout the evening. The intelligence she'd gathered painted a picture far more troubling than simple territorial unrest. It suggested coordinated efforts to test royal authority, potential infiltration of the king's own administration, and alpha networks that were actively evaluating his responses for signs of weakness they could exploit. King Ragnar was waiting for her in his private study, still dressed despite the early hour. Maps and documents spread across his desk in patterns that spoke of strategic planning that had continued throughout her absence. When she knocked and entered, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Report," he said simply, gesturing for her to take the chair across from his desk. For the next hour, Leora provided detailed accounts of every conversation she'd overheard, every interaction pattern she'd observed, and every individual who had displayed knowledge or behavior that seemed inconsistent with innocent social attendance. King Ragnar listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on documents she couldn't see, his expression growing increasingly grim as the full scope of what she'd discovered became clear. Alpha Blackwood's intervention was particularly revealing, she concluded. The way he warned against investigating too aggressively suggested either direct involvement or knowledge of who is involved, and the final conversation about your restrained response being interpreted as weakness that felt like evaluation by people preparing to escalate their challenges. It was evaluation, King Ragnar confirmed, setting down his pen with movements that spoke of barely controlled anger. And the evaluation is accurate. My measured responses have been encouraging bolder action from enemies who mistake strategic patience for inability to respond decisively. Will you change your approach? I'll change my approach when I understand exactly who I'm dealing with and what resources they command. His pale eyes met hers with uncomfortable intensity. Which brings us to your next assignment. The casual mention of additional espionage work sent both excitement and apprehension through her system. One successful intelligence-gathering operation had apparently earned her a permanent role in activities that were far more significant than she'd ever imagined when accepting his proposal. What kind of assignment? The kind that involves deeper infiltration of the networks you identified last night. Several of those alphas will be attending Lady Catherine Dorn's winter solstice celebration next week, a more intimate gathering where conversations tend to be less guarded, and alliances more visible. King Ragnar rose from his desk, moving to a cabinet that contained what appeared to be specialized equipment for purposes she couldn't identify. But this assignment will require more sophisticated preparation than simply observing from the margins of social events. What kind of preparation? The kind that involves teaching you to use tools that most intelligence agents require years of training to master. He returned to his desk carrying a small wooden box that looked innocuous but somehow radiated significance. Recording devices, chemical analysis equipment, communication tools that allow real-time coordination with handlers. The mention of such sophisticated espionage equipment made clear that her role in his intelligence operations was evolving far beyond simple observation and reporting. She was being prepared for work that required skills she'd never developed, training she'd never received, and responsibilities that could have consequences extending far beyond her personal safety. Why invest so much in someone with no experience in this kind of work? She asked, genuine curiosity overriding diplomatic caution. Surely, training experienced agents would be more efficient than starting from nothing with someone whose only qualification is invisibility. King Ragnar was quiet for a moment, his attention apparently focused on the contents of the wooden box. When he spoke, his words carried weight that seemed to extend beyond professional considerations. Because experienced agents have established patterns that enemies learn to recognize and counter. Because outsiders with no intelligence background often see things that professionals miss due to their training. And because... He paused, as if weighing how much to reveal about his motivations. Because my wolf insists that you're trustworthy in ways that have nothing to do with contracts or professional obligations. The admission sent awareness flooding through her, that their relationship had acquired dimensions extending beyond employer and agent, creditor and debtor, protector and protected. His wolf's assessment of her trustworthiness suggested bonds that operated on levels deeper than conscious decision-making. Your wolf, she repeated carefully. What does your wolf have to do with intelligence work? Everything, apparently. King Ragnar's slight smile held complex emotions she couldn't identify. Wolves don't lie about compatibility, Leora. And my wolf has been remarkably clear about his assessment of your character since the night you collapsed at our gates. Compatibility for what? For whatever role circumstances require you to fill. His pale eyes held hers with intensity that made her breath catch. Whether that's intelligence agent, advisor, or something more personal that neither of us has been willing to acknowledge directly. The suggestion of something more personal hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Leora felt her pulse quicken, as she tried to process implications that went far beyond professional partnership or debt-based service arrangements. Your Majesty, Ragnar, he interrupted quietly. When we're alone, when we're discussing matters that extend beyond formal royal business, you may call me Ragnar. The permission to use his personal name felt more intimate than any physical contact, acknowledging relationship dynamics that had been developing beneath the surface of their formal interactions. But before she could respond to what he was offering, a sharp knock at the study door interrupted their conversation. Enter, King Ragnar called, his tone shifting instantly from personal to professional, as his expression hardened into the mask of royal authority. Commander Eric Thorne entered with the kind of urgency that suggested developments requiring immediate attention. Your Majesty, we've received reports of 3 more incidents overnight, coordinated attacks on supply convoys in territories that had been quiet until now. Coordinated how? Same timing, same methods, same targets. Someone provided detailed intelligence about convoy routes and schedules that should have been confidential information. The commander's expression was grim with implications that made everyone in the room understand the gravity of what he was reporting. This wasn't spontaneous unrest, Your Majesty. This was planned military action. The intelligence Leora had gathered the night before suddenly acquired new urgency as what she'd witnessed transformed from political maneuvering into active rebellion against royal authority. The conversations about testing the king's responses, the evaluations of his measured approach, the warnings against investigating too aggressively, all of it had been preparation for escalation that was now occurring. What's our intelligence on who's coordinating these attacks? King Ragnar asked, though his glance toward Leora suggested he already suspected the answer would connect to what she'd observed at the Blackwood gathering. Limited, Your Majesty, but preliminary analysis suggests someone with access to administrative communications and detailed knowledge of territorial security protocols. Commander Thorne's attention shifted briefly to Leora, acknowledgement of her presence in discussions typically restricted to senior military officials. The kind of access that suggests infiltration at high levels of the royal administration. The confirmation that enemies had penetrated the king's inner circle sent ice through Leora's system, as she realized that her intelligence work had revealed only the visible surface of threats that extended far deeper into the foundations of royal authority than anyone had suspected. Double security protocols for all administrative communications, King Ragnar ordered. Institute compartmentalized information sharing for anything involving convoy schedules or territorial operations, and prepare comprehensive background investigations for anyone with access to the compromised intelligence. Yes, Your Majesty. There's one more thing. The attacks were accompanied by proclamations declaring that royal authority has become weak and ineffective, that Pack Alphas should take responsibility for territorial security, rather than relying on distant royal protection. The political dimension of the attacks became clear. They weren't just military actions, but propaganda designed to undermine confidence in royal authority while positioning local alphas as more effective alternatives. Exactly the kind of sophisticated coordination that the conversations Leora had overheard had suggested was being planned. Issue immediate responses clarifying that royal protection remains absolute and that any attempts to usurp territorial security will be treated as rebellion against the crown, King Ragnar said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had built an empire from warring packs. And prepare for the possibility that these attacks are preliminary actions intended to gauge our response capabilities. As Commander Thorne departed to implement security measures that would reshape how the royal administration handled sensitive information, King Ragnar turned his attention back to Leora with expression that had acquired new urgency. Your next assignment has become significantly more important, he said. The people orchestrating these attacks will be celebrating their success and planning their next moves. Lady Dorne's solstice gathering will likely provide opportunities to observe those celebrations and gather intelligence about future plans. What if they recognize me as an intelligence agent? Then you'll be protected by resources that can eliminate entire bloodlines if necessary. His voice carried the absolute certainty of someone whose authority had never been successfully challenged. But recognition is unlikely if you're careful about how you conduct your observations. As they spent the remainder of the morning reviewing equipment and techniques that would allow her to gather more detailed intelligence than simple observation could provide, Leora realized that her role in the king's operations had evolved far beyond what either of them had anticipated when she'd promised to reward his mercy. She was becoming his eyes and ears in places where royal authority was being actively challenged, someone whose intelligence could determine whether those challenges would be contained or whether they would explode into civil war that could reshape the political landscape of the entire continent. But more than that, she was becoming someone whose presence had awakened something in the king that extended beyond professional appreciation into territory that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge directly. As afternoon turned to evening, and her training continued, as she learned to use tools that could capture conversations from across rooms and analyze substances for signs of chemical manipulation, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that her desperate promise to reward King Ragnar's mercy had set in motion changes that would affect far more than her own survival. The reward was becoming something neither of them had expected. Not just intelligence that could preserve royal authority, but partnership that was reshaping both their lives in ways that extended far beyond the practical necessities of espionage and political survival. Whether those changes would lead to victory over the enemies threatening the kingdom, or whether they would create new complications that neither was prepared to handle, remained to be seen. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The debt she'd incurred by accepting his protection had evolved into something that couldn't be measured in terms of service rendered or obligations fulfilled. It had become something that looked suspiciously like destiny. 6 months later, the War Council chamber buzzed with the controlled tension that preceded decisive action. Maps and intelligence reports covering every available surface while the kingdom's most trusted advisors debated strategies that would determine the fate of the northern territories. But for all the military precision and political calculation filling the room, Leora found her attention drawn repeatedly to the man who sat at the head of the ancient oak table, his pale eyes cataloging every detail of the discussions with the focused intensity that had made him the most feared ruler in the continent. King Ragnar had changed in the months since her desperate plea at his gates had set their unlikely partnership in motion. The cold isolation that had once marked his every interaction had softened into something warmer, more collaborative, though his authority remained absolute when circumstances demanded decisive action. The rebellion that had threatened to tear the kingdom apart had been crushed through a combination of superior intelligence and surgical military strikes, intelligence that Leora's network of agents had provided, strikes that had eliminated the conspiracy's leadership without triggering the civil war they had sought to provoke. The Eastern Territories report complete stability, Commander Thorne was saying, his tone carrying satisfaction that spoke of problems finally resolved. No incidents for 3 months, no evidence of coordinated resistance, no intelligence suggesting renewed organization among the remaining conspirators. And the political situation? King Ragnar's attention shifted to Councillor Marcus Drain, whose analysis had proven invaluable during the months of careful investigation that had preceded the rebellion's collapse. The Alpha communities have accepted royal authority more completely than before the conspiracy emerged, Drain replied. Nothing like a failed rebellion to remind people why centralized power serves their interests better than territorial autonomy. The interrogations of captured conspirators revealed the full extent of their infiltration, added Lady Sarah Voss, whose intelligence analysis had helped identify traitors within the royal administration. 17 individuals with access to sensitive information, including 3 with positions that should have required absolute loyalty to the crown. Leora listened to the summary of victories achieved through work that had consumed the past 6 months, feeling satisfaction that went deeper than professional pride. The intelligence network she had built from nothing, Omega agents positioned throughout the territory, recording devices placed in locations where conspirators felt safe to speak freely, analysis techniques that had revealed patterns invisible to traditional investigation, had proven more effective than anyone had anticipated. What about long-term security? King Ragnar asked, his pale eyes meeting hers with the kind of trust that still surprised her with its completeness. Leora, what's your assessment of remaining threats? Minimal and fragmented, she replied, consulting reports from agents whose existence remained unknown to everyone, except the king and herself. The conspiracy's appeal was based on perception of royal weakness, and our response demonstrated strength that exceeded anything they'd anticipated. The remaining malcontents lack leadership, resources, and popular support necessary for organized resistance. Recommendations for maintaining that stability? Continue the intelligence network at reduced scale. Focus on economic development programs that give Pact communities stake in royal success rather than resentment of royal authority, and maintain visible, but not oppressive royal presence in territories that were most affected by the conspiracy's activities. The recommendations reflected lessons learned through 6 months of discovering that effective governance required balancing strength with wisdom, authority with responsiveness to legitimate concerns, that had made the conspiracy's propaganda initially attractive to wolves who felt abandoned by distant royal power. Approved, King Ragnar said, his tone carrying the finality of royal decree. Commander Thorne, implement the recommended security protocols. Councillor Drain, begin development of the economic initiatives. Lady Voss, coordinate with intelligence services to ensure continued monitoring of potential threats. As the meeting concluded, and advisors filed out to implement policies that would shape the kingdom's future, Leora remained in the chamber, that had become as familiar as her private quarters. The professional relationship that had begun with her desperate promise to reward the king's mercy had evolved into partnership that extended far beyond intelligence work into collaboration on every aspect of governance that affected the kingdom's welfare. "Satisfied with our results?" King Ragnar asked, as they found themselves alone among maps that showed territories now peaceful under royal authority. "Satisfied with the fact that people can live without fear of politically motivated violence," she replied honestly. "Whether our methods were the best possible approaches to achieving that result. I suppose that's something historians will debate long after we're gone." Regrets about the path that brought us here? The question carried personal weight that had nothing to do with political outcomes, and everything to do with the relationship that had developed between them during months of working together toward goals that served purposes larger than either of their individual interests. "No regrets," she said, turning to meet his gaze directly. "About the intelligence work, about the choices we made to protect the kingdom, about discovering that enemies can become partners when circumstances require collaboration for survival. Only about those things? About anything that's brought us to this point." Leora moved closer to where he stood beside the window that looked out over territories that were finally at peace, including the part where professional partnership became something more personal than either of us had planned. The admission of what had been developing between them for months, attraction that had grown from respect, affection that had deepened through shared challenges, love that had emerged from discovering they trusted each other more completely than either had thought possible, hung in the air like a promise finally spoken aloud. "I have a proposition for you," King Ragnar said, his voice carrying uncertainty that seemed strange coming from someone whose authority was absolute in every other aspect of his existence. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind that involves making our partnership permanent in ways that extend beyond professional collaboration." His pale eyes held depths of vulnerability she'd rarely seen from someone who had learned to rule through strength rather than revealing weaknesses that enemies could exploit. "The kind that involves marriage, shared authority, and the responsibility of ruling together rather than separately." The proposal was so unexpected that Leora felt her mind struggling to process its implications. "You're asking me to be your queen. I'm asking you to be my partner, in every sense that matters. Politically, personally, emotionally. Someone who shares the burdens of authority, rather than simply advising on how to bear them alone." King Ragnar moved closer, close enough that she could see the hope and fear competing in his expression. "The Omega who collapsed at my gates seeking shelter has become the person I trust more than anyone else in the kingdom. The woman who promised to reward my mercy has become someone whose presence makes mercy possible. And if I'm not ready for the responsibilities that come with being queen, then you'll learn them the same way you learn to be an intelligence agent, through experience, training, and the support of someone who believes in your capabilities, even when you doubt them yourself." His hands found hers, fingers intertwining with careful tenderness. "Leora, you've already been functioning as my partner in everything that matters. Marriage would simply formalize what we've already become." The truth of his observation was undeniable. She had been involved in policy decisions, military planning, and governance choices that affected millions of lives throughout the kingdom. The transition from desperate refugee to unofficial co-ruler had happened so gradually that she'd barely noticed how completely her circumstances had transformed. What about the political implications of a king marrying someone with no royal bloodline, no territorial connections, no family alliances that could strengthen the crown? "The political implications are that I'm choosing my queen based on character, intelligence, and proven loyalty, rather than dynastic considerations that serve other people's interests instead of the kingdom's welfare." King Ragnar's smile was sharp with satisfaction that spoke of decisions made without regard for traditional expectations. "Let the nobles adjust to the reality that royal marriages can be based on love and partnership rather than political convenience." "Love," she repeated, the word carrying weight that made her pulse quicken with recognition of feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge fully. Love. Deep, complicated, absolute love for someone who's proven that trust and respect can be more powerful foundations for partnership than fear or obligation ever were. The confession broke through the last of her resistance to accepting what had been growing between them for months. "I love you too," she said, her voice carrying certainty that surprised her with its completeness. "I love your strength and your wisdom, your willingness to listen to advice that challenges your assumptions, your capacity to change when change serves your people better than tradition. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who had been restraining desire longer than was sustainable. But it was also gentle, reverent, acknowledging the precious nature of what they were claiming together. "Marry me," he said against her lips, his voice rough with emotion that had nothing to do with royal authority and everything to do with personal vulnerability. "Be my queen, my partner, my conscience, and my strength." "Yes," she replied without hesitation, understanding that accepting his proposal meant stepping into a role she'd never imagined but felt prepared for, through months of discovering that leadership was something she could learn when circumstances required it. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through the noble families who had expected the king to choose his queen from among their daughters, but the response from the broader population was overwhelmingly positive. The story of the dying Omega who had collapsed at the royal gates only to become the kingdom's most effective intelligence agent captured imaginations throughout the territory, becoming a symbol of hope that merit could triumph over circumstances. Their wedding 6 weeks later was both a celebration of personal love and a political statement about the kind of kingdom they intended to rule together, one where worth was measured by contribution rather than birth, where loyalty was earned rather than inherited, where the crown served the people rather than the other way around. As Queen Leora stood beside her king during the ceremony that bound them together officially as well as emotionally, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Her desperate promise to reward his mercy had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. Not just personal love, but partnership in work that served purposes far greater than their individual happiness. The debt she'd incurred by accepting his protection had been paid in full through intelligence that had saved the kingdom from civil war. But the reward she'd promised had become something that would continue for the rest of their lives, not service or compensation, but love freely given and gratefully received. The poor Omega girl who had begged for shelter had become a queen whose presence had transformed not just her own life, but the nature of royal authority itself. And the feared king who had answered her plea had discovered that mercy extended without expectation of return could create bonds stronger than any forged through fear or obligation. Together, they would rule a kingdom that valued compassion as much as strength, wisdom as much as authority, and love as much as loyalty. Because some promises, once made, reshape not just the lives of those who make them, but the world they were made to protect. And sometimes the greatest rewards are the ones that neither party dared to hope for, when desperation forced them to seek shelter in the mercy of strangers. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.